Chelsea have been crowned as the 2022-2023 WSL Champions of the Year, whilst Reading at the bottom of the table sees relegation into the Championship. So, let's talk about it. The WSL season has wrapped up over the weekend, 132 games across the season, some incredible games, moments, scenes, goals, cards, fouls, you name it. This season pretty much was action-packed and had it all. With every season now, the competition has been getting tighter and tighter. Teams are getting tougher and tougher to beat. We're going down to the wire. We're going down to the last match day. We're going down to goal difference. It was goal difference this year that determined Champions League qualifications. It is getting very, very tight, but that also means it is getting very, very fun to watch. Today, I'm going to be going through every single club and how they ended on the table. So for starters, obviously, you're going to start up with the big boys, Chelsea. Their 4th consecutive WSL title, their 5th double, their 6th WSL title in the history of the club. These are some astounding numbers that I'm mentioning and crazy records, again, given how tight the competition has become. Chelsea didn't necessarily have the best of seasons this time. They obviously started off with a loss, but that's kind of a tradition that they always start the season off with a loss and then go and just win pretty much every single game after that. But for Chelsea, this was kind of a trickier season. They conceded the most amount of league goals than they had in the past 6 years. They were hit with some pretty big injuries. They were still kind of incorporating and adapting these new players that had come in. They were still also adapting to some of the players that had left. The players that left were pretty big, important figures in Chelsea's success and how Chelsea have been able to develop in the last few years. So with the likes of G and Anderson and such players leaving, it wasn't necessarily going to be the easiest switch. But on top of that, you had incorporating all these new players and then you were hit with an injury. It was like there was multiple things that Chelsea had to deal with this year. They lost to Manchester City. They drew the first fixture with Arsenal, kind of got dominated in that game as well. So for them, it wasn't the smoothest sailing season, but what we saw again and again is how clinical they can be. All Chelsea need, and all Chelsea did need in a lot of these games and a lot of these winning goals, was a single shot on goal, and they would snatch those 3 points. Down to players like Sam Kerr, it was down to players like Guro Reiten, who I think, in my opinion, was the player of the season for them. The Norwegian played the most amount of minutes for them, and obviously when a player is given that much of a responsibility and that much of a duty and she's able to deliver and she's able to clearly see these results, you have to give her some great credit. Not only did she finish with the most amount of assists, but the ridiculous amount of goal contributions. She is just so good. She's so different to a lot of the wingers that we see. She's not necessarily like that pacey winger that's always, she's pretty pacey, but she's not she's not your Lauren Hemp that's going to be dribbling past fullback. She's very different in how she builds up an attack and how much she opens spaces for Lauren James or for Ann Cuthbert or even for Sam Kerr. Again, she had the most amount of assists this season at an entire league. So that within itself should tell you something. Losing Millie Bright at a tough time, Khadija Buchanan as well, and still being able to make it to the semi-finals of the Champions League, obviously being beat by Barcelona. Again, not the easiest team to go ahead and beat, but they also drew with them at Camp Nou. Not many teams can say that they've done that. They've got the best and the deepest bench out of the entire league. And I was joking about this earlier, but imagine having the ability to take off Sam Kerr and replace her with Pernilla Harder. Not many teams have that ability. So for Chelsea, they definitely move away quite happy with this. They broke some incredible records. Sam Kerr being Sam Kerr again. Guro Reiten just absolutely terrorizing the league once more. There's a lot of heavy sources suggesting some big signings coming Chelsea's way, but that is definitely a different video, separate conversation, separate topic. For now, Emma Hayes and Chelsea move away as a very, very happy bunch. Dropping down 2 points, and we're going to be talking about Manchester United, who clinched their first ever Champions League qualification spot. This year, they also made it into their first ever final, the FA Cup final. Obviously, lost a very close one to Chelsea at Wembley. United are probably one of the few teams that can say that they didn't get hit by an injury crisis, and I think that certainly helped them a lot, which is, one, you can definitely give credit to the medical team and how they run their season and how they run their training sessions and X, Y, and Z. They were knocked out of the Conti Cup quite early. They didn't have Champions League football, so for them, the games that they needed to focus on were the league games and obviously the FA Cup. Anabatia is such a crucial role in United's development. This season around, they were really able to drill out that 4-2-3-1 formation that Skinner has been trying to integrate with them for quite some time now. I was able to actually detail it very, very nicely in a video, which I will link down below. So definitely go ahead and check it out. But for Skinner this time, yes, you can criticize him for some of the rotation, which I also was a big critical person of that. Next year's Champions League football and rotation is very important. So I'm hoping Skinner is able to learn a lot of these lessons. But for United, there was a lot of standout players. On Abatier, again, she made everything work. She was that middle puzzle piece that put everything together. Leah Golton, what a season that she's had. I mean, she terrorized everybody on that wing. She didn't necessarily add any quality to her game, rather than she just improved every quality that she had, which is something that I always really appreciate when players kind of focus on the qualities that they have and just build on those, rather than adding extra skills and kind of extra nitty-gritty things to their tools. Maya Leticia in the back, I mean, what a first season that she's had for them as well. And so for them, they looked like a very well-oiled, well-gelled team. Didn't really have to struggle a lot with injuries, which is a very big blessing considering just the ridiculous amount of injuries that we've had this season. Now it's about making sure that you keep the players that you need. I know Skinner has been talking about needing to recruit big and needing to go after big players now they're going into Europe. My suggestion would be make sure you keep the players that you need, aka on a Batier. You probably should be putting on like half of the ownership to try to keep her. Before you go and recruit, make sure you keep your players. And the third spot, Arsenal. I mean, what a story Arsenal have been on. For them to be able to go to the semi-final stages of the Champions League, to be able to clinch a Champions League spot now, and to be able to win the Conti Cup with, I mean, do you even call it an injury list at this point? It's like an injury squad. It's a completely full starting 11 squad that could probably start over the starting 11 that they're putting out. Often the league is won in your last 4 or 5 games. It's won in those nitty-gritty timings where you've got a concession of very hard run of games, or there's peak moments that your squad cannot be depleted at. And unfortunately for Arsenal, it's kind of a domino effect where one player would go down, the other would go down. It was like every other week you'd have a player out for a few weeks, or a player obviously out with an ACL injuries. I mean, 4 ACL injuries in a squad. Kim Little, their captain, out with a hamstring at the end. Leah Volti, Caitlin Ford also missed a very significant amount at the end. Lena Hurtig basically missed half of the season at this rate. That's a lot of injuries, and taking in consideration the fact that they loaned out Mana Uebuchi and they sold Jordan Nobbs, it was like, who's left? This did give a chance for some of these signings like Palova and Kuhl to integrate quite quickly and impress. Palova has been very, very impressive. I mean, she's a very bright talent and has been for some time in the Netherlands, but I doubt that when she signed she was going to be thrown into the starting 11 in the Champions League semi-final. But that's what Arsenal had to do, and you have to commend them for being able to do what they did throughout the season. As a player, you've just seen 4 of your teammates fall down to an ACL injury. What makes you think you can't be next? And that possibly also you could somehow speculate probably took a bit of a toll on these players. Frida Monum, I mean, she stepped it up, never afraid to take a shot, always happy to be around within the box causing chaos. Stina Blackstone is very similar to Leah Golton, where she didn't necessarily add to her toolbox, she just sharpened a lot of her toolbox. That hold-up game has improved. I mean, you could say 300% than last season, a lot more confident, a lot more able to find her feet on the field. And again, great timing to do that when your team really needs you. A Champions League spot and a cup is not a negative result at all to walk away. Who's going to be quite disappointed though is the blue side of Manchester. No qualification for the Champions League. There's also no cup that they were able to win. This is the worst result since 2014 season, so it's been 10 years since they've had to experience a season like this. We cannot dismiss that the core of Manchester City, the core of the squad that has been able to reach a lot of these achievements, departed in the summer. Kira Walsh, Lucy Bronze, Stanway, Caroline Weir. I mean, it's a long list, and it's not just, your regular bench warmer or the player that would be as a super sub. It was your starting 11, your players that you could count on. Vicky Losada even moving on halfway through the season. So for them, it was a challenge to adapt, and I thought actually they recruited pretty well in the summer. Bunny Shaw having the season of her life, fitter than ever. It was almost like the departure or the retirement of Ellen White gave Bunny Shaw finally the consistency of minutes that she should have been getting even when Ellen White was in the squad. They were also dealing with a fair amount of injuries, a lot of kind of minor injuries. A player would come back, leave Demi Stokes, Alana Kennedy. I mean, you barely really even saw them throughout the season. They didn't start off the season so great, but then they were absolutely flying through everybody, kind of that end of the year season, that Christmas area, I mean, they were just demolishing everybody. Looking at their fixtures with the top three, I mean, they beat Arsenal, they beat Chelsea, they drew with United. But then you look at their other fixtures and they lost 4 points to Aston Villa, and they were knocked out in the cup to Aston Villa. It was like Aston Villa was just their kryptonite, and it came down to goal difference for them, and I think they're really going to be beating themselves up for a lot of the chances that they missed. I mean, they had the most amount of created chances in the league, they had the most amount of shots in the league, yet it came down to goal difference with them. It's a very ironic storyline. It's like you had the most amount of chances in the league, but you also lost a qualification spot because of goal difference. I wonder how this outcome is going to affect their summer transfers. They need to get pretty active. I know Gareth Taylor has suggested that they won't be very active, but I highly suggest they need to be active. Julia Blackstad out on loan. You know, Gareth Taylor, I'm not sure if in the past season or two he's really been able to get his stars and his players to show their full potential. I mean, he's got the Lionesses' big faces of Chloe Kelly and Lauren Hemp. They had a good season, but it was nothing groundbreaking, and I think players like that should be having absolutely phenomenal seasons. Again, it goes back to your manager, who has that responsibility of making sure you absolutely excel at everything, and they've offered him a 1-year extension. Doesn't really show a lot of commitment from the club. It's almost like, show me what you can do in this 1 year, and if it doesn't work out, we'll get you out of there. So it's interesting to see what kind of ambitions they have with him and what his stance is, but I'm not really getting the best attitude from him, which will be interesting to see how they handle the summer. In number 5, we've got Aston Villa. Rachel Daly, Carla Ward. I mean, what a season. Where Aston Villa really properly aced it this year round was they invested in recruitment. Often when we talk about investment, it's like, okay, well, is that going into promotion? Is that going into infrastructure? Is that going into training? Is that going to staff and facilities? Is it going to recruitment? Where is that investment going? And to be able to answer that question, you need to look at your board. You need to look at the long-term vision. You know, where is this club going? What am I trying to achieve? Am I trying to achieve going from 10 to 7? What's the goal here? And for Aston Villa, I think they answered this question brilliantly, because they invested a fair amount of money, but they put it all into recruitment. And a lot of the recruitment that didn't even need transfer fees, they drilled very well, making sure that the players that they wanted to get on loan were perfectly suitable players. Anna Patton from Arsenal, Kirsty Hansen from United. They also got Stanford for free from United. Jordan Nobbs, reportedly 80,000. I mean, that is a bargain for a player like Jordan Nobbs. It's been a long time coming for Daly to make that move and back home. And I mean, I've watched her for as long as she's been at Houston Dash. I mean, she's absolutely brilliant. But this time around, she was the star of the show. She was the star of the team. I mean, she equaled Viviana Miedema's goal record in a season, 22 goals. You're talking about Viviana Miedema, like, that's absolutely wild. And what's so funny is that when Carla Ward signed her, she was like, I'd be thrilled if she can get 8 goals for us. Not only did she definitely get you 8 goals, but Rachel Daly, within herself, scored more goals than Aston Villa did that last season combined. Just a single player scored more goals for you this season than your entire squad did last season. I mean, that speaks volume. Everton, for me, was going to be a very similar pattern to Aston Villa in terms of they're going to be making that final push to make a very mid-table finish rather than be in a relegation battle like they were last season. Everton had some really promising preseason signs. They signed a new management, Brian Sorensen, obviously. This allowed them to have an identity. You'd watch Everton and you'd know what their style would look like. They also had some really good loans with the likes of Jess Park from City on them. The last few games, and certainly towards the end of the season, that form did drop. I mean, however, they did almost make a comeback against City on the final day. Already announced some departures. It's going to be interesting to see how they're going to deal with those departures. But I think for them, looking at last season, they were battling relegation. This time around, they were able to get some really good performances, put an identity, stabilize the management. I think for them, you can definitely call it a successful campaign. Just under them, their Merseyside rivals, Liverpool. I mean, Liverpool was a newly promoted side in the WSL, and usually what that means is that when the promoted team comes up, their goal is to avoid relegation. And so for them, they definitely avoided relegation, and they did so quite comfortably with some major injuries throughout the season, some of them at the start of the season. They lacked consistency. There were some performances that you were like, this is absolutely abysmal, but then there was performances where they beat Manchester City and they beat Chelsea. For Matt Beard, there's going to be a lot of room of improvement to see why that happened. Make sure that consistency isn't so much of an issue. They have a lot of players departing. again, a lot of holes need to fill up. A lot of the players that were injured, you need to make sure you're integrating them properly back into the squad. With a little bit more investment and a healthier squad, I think next season they could be your Aston Villa. But for a newly promoted team to make sure they completely avoid relegation, it's a dub. West Ham United finishing 8th, a very, very underwhelming season to what at the start looked like a very promising start. Dagny Bryansdottir was in absolutely incredible form. I mean, terrific form. Some really early goals every time they started. They won 3 out of their first 5 fixtures. It looked like they were going to put themselves in a very strong position. They were going to be the team to challenge those top 3. I mean, they did have a draw with Arsenal, but really nothing more challenging than that. They were never in danger of relegation, which to me was astonishing because they've only won a game since December. A singular game since December. I mean, that is just absolutely like relegation form. They looked very disjointed, very kind of like we just want the season to be over, which is a completely different attitude than what was at the start of the season. They got absolutely demolished in the FA Cup against Chelsea 7-0. They lost that identity. They lost the good performance that they could occasionally put on. They're known to usually have the biggest turnover of squad in the WSL. Not the case last season, but has been the case since they've been in the WSL. So I wonder if it's going to be another conversation of that. They're going to need a little bit of investment. They're also going to need a new head coach since they've separated with Paul Kaczynski. To be quite honest, by the time I hit April, I was genuinely surprised as to how Paul was in his position, considering he just won game since December. There's this notion of he's an ex-West Ham player, he played on the men's side, this whole idea of we should kind of have this honorary role for him that possibly played into this conversation, and I don't like that. I hope this is not something that we allow in the women's game. It shouldn't happen. Point blank period. When he was appointed last year, he was given a 2-year contract, but obviously decided to cut it early this time round, which way too late anyway. Their previous coach, Ollie Harder, is also currently out of a job after he got sacked of his own position, but Ollie Harder also gave them their best and their highest ever finish in the WSL last season, so probably reverting back to him would not be the worst option. Again, I'm not too sure why the separation happened initially anyway. But if it's not Ollie Harder they're going after, I wonder if they make any kind of contact with Kelly Chambers, who just got relegated with Reading. Tottenham Spurs, very, very disappointing season. They finished 5th last year, and this time to be finishing 9th is completely unacceptable. They spent a significant amount of money in transfers. They had built a strong foundation under Rhian Skinner, but they went on a 9-game losing streak that eventually meant that she had to depart and she was let go. Unsurprisingly, this was the right decision. Skinner was always known for her defensive style of play, and that's when she had a role with England. That's kind of why she was brought in, but this time around, she clearly wasn't able to convey those ideologies on the field. During that 9-game losing streak, I really do not think Tottenham was able to put 4 passes together. It was so poor, and I don't think I missed a single game for them, but at the same time, I don't think I can say I recall them playing X, Y, and Z because there was nothing significant or there was nothing happening. There was no identity whatsoever for me to remember watching them play, and that's just how poor they were. I really am curious to just open up a game from one of these games that they lost in that streak and just see if they put 4 or 5 passes together, because they did not. Given the quality of the squad, they need to be doing a lot better, and had Beth England not arrived, I don't know what could have happened for the club. They put in a lot of money to bring her in, and absolutely every single penny has been worth it because every single goal just really pushed them out of that relegation battle. She almost scored the 3rd out of their WSL goals. That just should say it as is, and she only arrived in January. Things to reconsider, because this is not really where Tottenham should be right now. I mean, it really has been a season of 2 halves for Leicester. They were favorites to go down, barely surviving last year. At the start of the season, it looked like it was going to be a repeat of that, but departure of manager Lydia Bedford, who actually is now an assistant manager at Arsenal. So funny how this game works. Willie Kirk arrives. He's got some really great experience with teams of that position or in teams of that caliber as well. He took over, made some really important calls, really important signings. They actually had fielded the most amount of players this season purely because of just the amount of new signings they had made when Willie Kirk arrived. They picked up points against Brighton, against Everton. They had very, very important wins over Reading and Liverpool, which kind of really pushed them out of that relegation zone. The arrival of Willie Kirk and the arrival of the new players was absolutely just league-changing, but specifically you have to narrow it down to the loan spell that they were able to secure for Janina Leitzing from Bayern Munich. She had the most amount of saves out of the entire WSL, and she's only arrived in January. And that is a very, very massive stat to have. A lot of the draws and the wins and just whatever points they were able to pick up, you can at least put put it down to 4 or 5 saves that she was able to make every single game. In a very similar ship, in a very similar boat with Brighton. Brighton did have a little bit of a rockier start because they went through multiple different managers. Longtime servant at the club, Hope Powell, was removed after there was a heavy fear of relegation. Who replaced her was her assistant manager, Amy Phillips, who was the interim manager at the time. Probably one of the worst thought decisions throughout the season was the signing of Jens Schur. His resume is really top-notch. He's been in the Champions League. He has worked with Bayern Munich. That kind of is the big golden thing on his resume. He would have been the first German manager to join the WSL, so any kind of that German title as a manager would hold a lot of value. His CV was a really great one, and he has worked quite well in the women's game. What we saw this time is clubs would recognize that when their club is not doing well, they're kind of ready to take that risk. And that risk would usually come a little later than it should, but it was a great initiative to see some of these clubs. Another lesson that was taught is when you go out and recruit somebody who has worked in the Champions League, who has worked with the big dogs like the Frauen Bundesliga and the Bayern Munichs and, all these big names. And if you bring him in and expect him to take you out of a relegation battle, it simply won't work. He came in and said, we need to work hard. I want the players to get out of training super tired. Clearly he didn't connect with the players. He wasn't able to get his philosophy through the players on the pitch. It was a really overall just disastrous signing, but a great lesson for other clubs and Brighton that when you want to get a manager, you just can't see, Champions League, slot him in. You need to be able to match them to what you're trying to do, which is, in Brighton's case here, is get out of the relegation battle. So he left, and then Amy Phillips took over again as interim, and then the big signing of Melissa Phillips took over. Phillips started off the season working with the London Lionesses in the Championship. They were absolutely flying under her, and then opportunity presented herself to fly and work with Angel City FC in the NWSL. Phillips is American, so not a surprise that when an opportunity at home presents itself, likely you're going to take it. Angel City is a big club, and it just seemed like the right move for her now to go back home. And then in a very bold and ambitious way, it all happened within like a month where she departed, was in the US, and then all of a sudden she was back for Brighton. Their performances improved dramatically. They were able to pick up points and slowly but surely were really able to kind of remove themselves from that relegation spot. The club has given them a lot of resources. They've invested in infrastructure, and I think now for the personnel, for the players, for Melissa Phillips and her staff, it's being able to take advantage of those resources being given to you. But for them, they'd be very pleased to just avoid relegation. Now, who did not avoid relegation, unfortunately, is Reading. Reading has been in the WSL in the past 8 years. They got promoted in 2015. Their manager, Kelly Chambers, has been with them since 2007, so she's been through the whole thing of getting promoted, keeping them in the WSL, and then now relegated with them. So she knows the club, inside and out, everywhere. Reading, since being promoted, have consistently had the lowest budget out of any team, and specifically in the last 3 years, they were always expected to drop, and they always somehow defied these odds, somehow overachieved and proved people wrong, and somehow Kelly Chambers was able to keep them. And I think it's actually kind of a miracle how it took them this long to drop, given just how tiny of a budget they've always worked on. But you can only have the lowest WSL budget for so long, and when you see other teams in the same relegation zone like Brighton, like Leicester, have that fear of relegation and inject a ridiculous amount of money with the likes of getting Willie Kirk and all of his recruitment. Same thing with Melissa Phillips. That money, Reading just simply don't have. You really can't help but feel a little bit sad for Reading, because not only have the men's been relegated from the EPL, but now they've been relegated from the Championship, and it's hard to see what kind of resources they're going to be working with. They're the only squad that didn't have Premier League backing this season. They were hit by Deanne Rose, who I still don't think has been talked about enough on how big of a impact she has. She wasn't able to return on the pitch until the second last game of the season, and when she did come on and play those spells of 30 minutes, you could really tell what the team was missing. A lot of players are going to be leaving. It'll also be interesting to see what Deanne Rose, I feel like a mid-table move for her in the WSL is probably pending, but for Kelly Chambers, it's quite upsetting. But you have to like that manager. She's one of the youngest, and she has been one of the most experienced in the WSL. I wonder if teams like West Ham are going to be knocking on her door, or even Tottenham. She's also very heavily pregnant, so I can't even imagine having to go through the stress of relegation and this huge budget issues, and then being pregnant on top of that. So honestly, you just have to be... I just feel really bad for Reading and Kelly Chambers, if I'm 1,000% honest here. You never want to see a club relegated, and definitely not a club that has the good people like Kelly Chambers and some really good players, but just unfortunately not good enough, and just they couldn't spend any money on transfers. It's hard to see them do any better than what they did. It's like 11 points was the best they could get. Taking their spot is going to be Bristol City. Bristol City have had their own spells in the WSL. Their main goal, just like Liverpool's was this season, is to avoid relegation and make sure they don't drop back down into the championship. This season, I think for a lot of fans had a lot of different mixed emotions, because I, as a neutral, absolutely hated seeing the amount of players that would go down. I mean, we also missed the likes of Pernilla Harder and Frank Kirby at the top, so definitely a season that didn't feature a lot of its stars, and injuries is the one to blame once again. But what we did have this season was a record in every kind of area. We had the FA Cup final record, we also had new WSL records, we had Champions League records that took place in London. And a time where you're really trying to grow and you're really trying to keep that participation locked in and trying to get people engaged as much as you can, it can be quite risky to see a lot of the big names fall. So, Frank Kirby, Pernilla Harder, again, Leah Williamson, Beth Mead, Viviana Miedema, massive names that you can't deny have a big drive for the success of the league. And when you see names like that fall and not be able to be on the pitch every weekend, that is risky. But what we were able to see is that it is not just it's not just concentrated in the top 1 and 2 or 3. But the competition of the mid-table teams, the rise of Aston Villa, what the relegation teams were able to do and how they pulled themselves out of the position they were in. A lot of fun, and you just can't hate on this league. It's just so fun. I want to know your opinions, your thoughts on the league. I mean, what was your favorite moment? Who do you think was the standout player for yourself? I want to hear it all. There's a lot of chatter going on in the league. There's a lot of chatter of reflection on some of the players, the teams, the end results. I want to hear it all. And yeah, make sure you share it and let me know. As always, to stay updated and to continue enjoying the beautiful game, make sure you subscribe to me here on YouTube and follow me on Twitter. I'm so excited for all of the transfer news and talks that are going to come out. It's going to be a lot of content this summer. It's going to be a lot of World Cup content, so you definitely want to stay tuned in and catching up on everything you need to know about the game. There's so much going on. You want to stay tuned.